Hello, and welcome to the webinar on implementing HUD's smoke-free public housing. My name is Monica Shepard, Director of PIH's Public Housing Management and Occupancy Division. Today, I will present on the overview and requirements of HUD's smoke-free rule. This is one in a series of 3 webinars designed to familiarize PHA staff with the new rule. This webinar will cover the following topics: smoke-free rule overview, locations where the rule applies, prohibited products, other aspects of the rule, how to customize your policy, and questions about the rule. Although the webinar focuses on the details of the rule, it is not a substitute for reading and familiarizing yourself with the rule in its entirety. In addition to this webinar, there are 2 other webinars, one on enforcement and the other on community development, to help you familiarize yourself with other aspects of the rule and help with the smooth rollout of your PHA's smoke-free policy. On February 3, 2017, the Department of Housing and Urban Development's final rule instituting smoke-free public housing went into effect. The rule states that each PHA must implement a smoke-free policy no later than 18 months from the effective date of the rule. PHAs will have to implement their smoke-free policy no later than July 30, 2018. Some PHAs may choose to implement earlier. PHAs that already have a smoke-free policy will have to ensure that it is in conformance with the new rule. The rule specifically states that all interior spaces must be smoke-free, including all common areas. The rule applies to all public housing units, including scattered sites and single-family homes. The rule also states that exterior spaces within 25 feet of any structure, administrative or residential, must be smoke-free. The final rule does not apply to tribal housing, mixed finance developments, or PHA properties that have converted to project-based rental assistance contracts under RAD. However, if the PHA already has a smoke-free policy for these types of developments, changes are not necessary. The PHA is allowed to have smoke-free policies for all the units it manages, but the mandate from this rule only applies to public housing units. This rule applies to certain products, anything with lit tobacco. It also includes water pipes and hookahs. E-cigarettes are not covered by the rule, but PHAs have the discretion to include them in their local policy. The rule does not prohibit residents from using these products. Rather, it requires that they not be used in the areas where tobacco use is restricted. PHAs should continue to lease to residents who smoke. HUD remains committed to helping all people secure quality housing. Other aspects of the rule includes the following. The smoke-free policy must be included in the PHA plan, the emissions and continued occupancy policy, and the tenant lease. HUD has clarified that the adoption of a smoke-free policy is likely to constitute a significant amendment or modification to the PHA plan, which would require PHAs to conduct public meetings according to standard PHA amendment procedures. Therefore, PHAs are encouraged to obtain board approval when creating their smoke-free policies. Best practices have shown that providing information sessions for residents, surveying residents on their opinions about a smoke-free rule, and providing training for staff will improve the ease of implementation of the rule. For more information on best practices, see the guidebook Changes in the Air, as well as additional forthcoming HUD guidance. PHAs must adopt and implement the smoke-free policy by July 30, 2018. Again, PHAs should begin implementation well in advance of the deadline. Implementation dates should be clearly communicated to residents and staff and clearly stated in the PHA plan and tenant lease. PHAs are encouraged to include an enforcement plan as part of the smoke-free policy. Violating the smoke-free policy is considered a lease violation. If a PHA pursues lease enforcement as a remedy, public housing residents retain their rights under the PHA's grievance procedures that must be followed before tenancy can be terminated. More information on enforcement of the smoke-free policy can be found in the enforcement webinar. PHA should also consider how they will manage requests for reasonable accommodations in the context of the new policy. Details about reasonable accommodations are discussed later in this presentation. In the next section, the focus of the discussion will be on local flexibilities and opportunities for PHAs to customize their respective policies. PHAs may use the input of residents, board of directors, resident advisory boards, staff, and others to determine how to customize the smoke-free policy. Your policy must include all the stipulations in HUD's rule, but can be expanded to further protect your residents, staff, and property. When customizing your smoke-free policy, you must first consider which provisions of the rule are mandatory and those that are optional. The mandatory provisions of the rule are on the left side of the slide, which I discussed in detail previously, and the provisions that can be customized are on the right side of the slide. Customizable options include areas on the PHA grounds beyond the required 25-foot perimeter that can be designated as smoke-free. Examples include sidewalks and playgrounds. The PHA may opt to make all grounds smoke-free except for designated smoking areas beyond the 25-foot perimeter. Another option is to designate the entire grounds of the PHA as smoke-free. That is, no smoking will be allowed anywhere on the grounds, even beyond the 25-foot perimeter. PHAs may decide to build structures for people who smoke. However, all structures must be compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. No additional funding will be provided for designated smoking areas, but PHAs have the flexibility to use their capital funds to build such structures. Also, the rule designates specific prohibited tobacco products, particularly lit tobacco. This includes cigars, cigarettes, and water pipes, as well as hookahs. PHAs are allowed to expand their list of prohibited products. PHAs may consider prohibiting electronic nicotine delivery systems such as e-cigarettes or other products such as incense. When developing enforcement procedures, it is important to establish the ways in which residents and/or staff can report suspected violations of the smoke-free policy. A PHA must sufficiently enforce its smoke-free policy in accordance with the rule's standards. PHAs must ensure due process when enforcing the lease. Establishing a formal policy of what constitutes evidence of a violation and clarifying the process of escalating enforcement will increase transparency with residents and staff. HUD recommends a graduated enforcement policy approach. More detailed information on this topic is discussed in the enforcement webinar. The smoke-free policy must be included in the PHA's annual or 5-year plan as applicable. HUD has clarified that the adoption of a smoke-free policy is likely to constitute a significant amendment or modification to the PHA plan. Therefore, the process for making such amendments or modifications must be followed in accordance with HUD regulations and the PHA's policies. During enforcement of smoke-free housing policies, HUD expects PHAs to follow its administrative grievance procedures. The lease and appropriate amendments will be the primary smoke-free policy enforcement mechanism. All residents must sign the amendment or amendments as a condition of their continued occupancy. Violating the smoke-free policy is a lease violation. If a PHA pursues lease enforcement as a remedy, public housing residents retain their rights under the PHA's grievance procedures that must be followed before tenancy can be terminated. The goal of the smoke-free rule is to protect residents from the harms of secondhand smoke and to reduce the risk of fires. More information on enforcement of the policy will be discussed in the enforcement webinar. Another component of the smoke-free policy is reasonable accommodations. The PHA must make this determination on a case-by-case basis. When a person with a disability requests an accommodation related to his or her disability, the PHA must make the accommodation unless they can demonstrate that doing so would result in a fundamental alteration in the nature of its program or undue financial and administrative burden. Additionally, the PHA may deny an accommodation request if it would pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others that cannot be eliminated or mitigated. For example, allowing residents to continue to smoke in their dwelling units is not considered a reasonable accommodation. In order to show that a requested accommodation may be necessary, there must be an identifiable relationship or nexus between the requested accommodation and the individual's disability. When accommodating persons with disabilities, HUD encourages PHAs to engage with disabled residents who may require a reasonable accommodation when developing the smoke-free policy, and to work with social services agencies to identify other alternatives to smoking in their dwelling units. Here are the next steps to ensure your housing authority is ready in advance of the implementation deadline. HUD has already started to receive questions on the rule, and we encourage PHAs to continue to send questions to our email at smokefreepublichousing@hud.gov. The following are 2 questions related to implementation. The first, the smoke-free rule was effective February 3rd, 2017. What is the date all PHAs must be in compliance with the smoke-free rule? Well, all PHAs must adopt and implement smoke-free policies by July 30th, 2018, which is 18 months from the effective date of the rule. The second question is, what does the smoke-free rule prohibit? Smoking of any lit tobacco products, cigarettes, cigars, water pipes, hookahs, within dwelling units, common areas, and within a 25-foot perimeter around those areas, and PHA administrative buildings. There are 2 other webinars on the smoke-free rule. They are enforcement and community engagement. Feel free to contact us at this email address with any questions, smokefreepublichousing@hud.gov. You may find copies of this webinar, fact sheets, the guide, Changes in the Air, and other resources at the website on this slide. Thank you for participating, and be sure to tune in to the other informative webinars on HUD's smoke-free rule for public housing.
Hello, and thank you for watching this webinar on HUD's smoke-free public housing rule. My name is Tara Radosevich. I'm a special assistant in the Office of Public Housing and Voucher Programs. The topic for this webinar is enforcement of smoke-free policies. The content is geared toward Public Housing Authority, or PHA, staff. As part of implementing a smoke-free policy, residents will want to know how the PHA will monitor compliance and what the consequences will be for violations. PHAs have generally had discretion in deciding how to enforce their smoke-free policy. Under the regulations, however, smoking in public housing units, common areas, offices, and within 25 feet of the building will be a lease violation and should be enforced. One big challenge in implementing a smoke-free policy is recognizing that smoking is an addiction. Many of us grew up with smokers and watched them struggle to quit or adjust when smoking was banned in restaurants. Some of us smoke ourselves. We know that many public housing residents will not want to go outside for every cigarette. For some, this change will just be inconvenient, while for others it may feel impossible. Thanks to the over 600 PHAs that have already gone smoke-free, however, we know that smoke-free policies and enforcement can work and will ultimately result in increased resident satisfaction, decrease maintenance costs, and improve health. The experience of these PHAs provided a lot of the content you will see today. This webinar includes the requirements of the rule, with additional approaches developed and tested by PHAs that contributed to their success. Today's agenda will include an overview of the webinars available, a refresher on the smoke-free rule, how to develop an enforcement plan as part of your smoke-free policy, successful strategies for compliance, and other resources for assistance. Please note this webinar is not a substitute for reading and familiarizing yourself with the rule. This webinar enforcement is part of a series to help you familiarize yourself with the new requirements and enable a smooth rollout of the smoke-free policy for your residents. Additional webinars include an overview of the rule and community engagement. These webinars are posted on the Smoke-Free Public Housing webpage on HUD.gov. This website will be provided at the end of the webinar. Background on the smoke-free rule. PHAs will have to implement their smoke-free policy no later than July 30th, 2018. To be ready for that date, PHAs should start the process of resident engagement and policy development well in advance of the deadline. This slide includes a key refresher on the elements covered in the rule overview webinar. Why is enforcement important? Just like any lease provision, without enforcement, the smoke-free policy will not succeed. Tenants should be engaged in the policy development and should help formulate the enforcement aspect of the policy as well. Having a clear and consistent enforcement policy is part of the partnership and will help ensure residents understand the consequences for violations well in advance of a lease termination. Smoke-free policy elements. This slide covers the key elements of a plan and a graduated approach to enforcement. A graduated approach includes escalating warnings and documentation of those warnings in the file record. If a violation proceeds to lease termination and eviction, the PHA will want to have a clear record of the violations and notice to the resident. A PHA must enforce its smoke-free policy in accordance with its other lease violations and the rule standards. By taking action when a resident is violating the policy, PHAs will build trust with all the residents. PHAs must ensure due process when enforcing the lease and adhere to the grievance process when a termination is initiated. It's important to note, however, that the smoke-free rule does not make smoking a bar to public housing tenancy. Smokers can still live in public housing. PHAs should make the smoke-free policy clear to potential residents, but should not ask if the applicant smokes. Developing a plan. This slide provides recommendations included in the rule, guidance, and from PHAs interviewed by HUD. These are the best practices that will help you develop and implement an effective smoke-free plan. Engaged residents that fully understand the enforcement policy will be less likely to violate it, especially if their concerns are discussed or addressed before the policy is final. The first part of an enforcement plan should be finding ways to achieve compliance without enforcement and prevent the need for a lease termination. Many of the residents served by public housing would likely not be successful in market rate housing, and the administrative costs of enforcement and eviction can be an impact to your agency. When developing the plan, consider mitigating circumstances for initial violations. There may be reasons why a resident is reluctant to leave their unit to smoke. For example, does your PHA have a designated smoking area with seating? Are all the elevators working? If there are physical barriers or safety concerns, the resident may opt to stay inside to smoke and will continue to do so if there are no consequences. If the PHA can remove some of these barriers, it will be easier for residents to comply. Residents that smoke indoors will have to change their personal habits, and it will take time for them to adjust. Smoke-free violations are civil, not criminal lease violations. The rule made this distinction to separate smoking from drug-related offenses. One-strike policies are generally not appropriate for smoking violations, but PHAs should be consistent with other policies. How can the policy be enforced? There are a variety of approaches to enforcement. The most common is to use a combination of staff reports and tenant reports. Your PHA can develop a systematic way of logging reports and tracking violations. This can provide important information to your residents and Board of Commissioners about the success of the policy and help inform future updates to the policy. The smoke-free policy should specify what kind of reports should be received. You may want to limit reports to just observed incidences of smoking or smoke intrusion into a unit. While resident tips are helpful, especially if property management staff are away from the site, it could result in community disruption if residents use it to retaliate against each other. The process for receiving and documenting residents' complaints is up to the PHA, but it should be clearly outlined in the policy if these complaints will be used as part of lease enforcement. Benefits of an enforcement plan. An easy-to-understand enforcement plan will help tenants and staff understand how the smoke-free policy will be carried out. This includes fair, documented, and consistent enforcement, increased transparency, realistic expectations, and more uniform implementation. Plan implementation. The enforcement plan is part of the smoke-free policy. Once completed, the plan should be presented to the Resident Advisory Board and Board of Commissioners. For implementation, the lease or lease amendment will be the primary smoke-free policy enforcement mechanism. All residents must sign the amendment as a condition of their new or continuing occupancy. Resources for residents. Residents who smoke are key to your plan. If they do not participate or cooperate, then the policy will be difficult to implement. Make sure that all residents have resources well in advance of policy implementation, so that they will have a chance to quit if they so desire. Many areas have active health departments with resources for smoking cessation. Every state has a toll-free quit line. Consider again the barriers to success, such as poor lighting in areas available for smoking or lack of seating. Residents are being asked to change their behavior, and this is difficult for anyone without support. HUD's guide, Changes in the Air, and the Resident Toolkit provide more tools to assist your residents. These materials are posted on the HUD.gov Smoke-Free Public Housing webpage. This website will be provided at the end of the webinar. Enforcement resources are groups and organizations that will play a role in developing and implementing your smoke-free policy. A working relationship with local resources such as legal aid, the health department, and social services should be established early in the development of the smoke-free policy. This will help ensure that these entities are familiar with the policy and available to assist residents as appropriate. PHAs may offer opportunities for these entities to engage with tenants by providing smoking cessation group therapy classes in PHA meeting space, distributing smoking cessation aids, such as nicotine patches at the PHA, or providing free transport to a local health clinic for smoking cessation-related interventions. Boston Housing Authority is a good example of a PHA that has been smoke-free for many years with lessons learned to pass on to their peers. Over the years, they updated their policy to better serve the mission and residents. Originally, the enforcement plan included multiple warnings and referrals to cessation services. The current plan has 2 steps. After the first reporting complaint, the resident signs an agreement to abide by the policy and pays a small fine. And secondly, after a second report or complaint, the manager will have a second private conference with the resident. This could result in a notice to quit or a lease termination if it is determined that the smoking violation has occurred. Duluth HRA in Minnesota was an early adopter of smoke-free policies. They established a strong partnership with the American Lung Association, and this helped connect residents to smoking cessation services. Duluth HRA is an example I like to point out when PHAs think they will not be successful going smoke-free because they live in a cold climate. Duluth's steps included multiple warnings and referrals to cessation services. Their current steps are, after the first report or complaint, the resident signs an agreement to abide by the policy and pays a small fine, and after a second report or complaint, the manager will have a second private conference with the resident. This could result in a notice to quit if it is determined that a smoking violation has occurred. The key takeaway from the Boston and Duluth examples is that there's no one-size-fits-all enforcement policy, and the decision should be made locally and be consistent with other lease enforcement policies. But there are best practices that may be unique to smoke-free enforcement, such as working with resident to get support for behavior changes, taking action when there are violations, and keeping the records of infractions if the case proceeds to lease termination. Key elements of an enforcement plan. This slide summarizes the requirements and recommendations of the rule and outlines responsibilities of the PHA and the residents. Each PHA has flexibility in developing its enforcement plan. While HUD encourages a multi-step process, the number of steps and their nature, verbal, written, in-person meetings, are at the discretion of the PHA. The PHA will want to treat its residents as partners in the policy and the plan. Many residents will be supportive of going smoke-free, and others will be won over when the policy is effective at improving indoor air quality. Limits of the PHA's roles and considerations. In the real world, we know that implementation of the smoke-free policy and its enforcement will not always be smooth. There will probably be more violations in the early phase of implementation, and it still may feel too soon for residents, even with advance notice. It's important that all the key players, including the Board of Commissioners, have realistic expectations. You may want to consult with an attorney to review the policy before it is final, and include a statement that failure to enforce does not negate the right to enforce the policy in the future. Other PHAs that have already gone smoke-free have provided insight and may be helpful to you as you decide on your enforcement strategies. The first example is from King Housing Authority. The next and final example is from Twin Falls Housing Authority in Idaho. HUD's guide, Changes in the Air, provides additional examples from both PHAs and private management companies that have already gone smoke-free. Here are the next steps to make sure you are ready by July 30th, 2018 to be smoke-free. Start the process to notify your board, update your plan, and update your lease agreements. Updated leases must be executed before July 30th, 2018. You can decide how to best do this for your PHA, either at the annual re-examination or at the same time for a large group of residents. If residents request reasonable accommodations, consider them in light of your policy. but be sure to read the final rule for guidance from HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity on considerations. HUD has already started receiving questions on the rule, and we encourage PHAs to continue to send your questions to our email, smokefreepublichousing@hud.gov. Question: can a PHA establish a fine for a smoking violation? Although permissible, fines must be tailored to an actual lease violation and must be reasonable. Fines can also be subject to court review and should be clearly outlined for residents. PHAs have flexibility on how they structure their public housing leases and what provisions they choose to incorporate therein, provided that the lease follows state and local laws. If you are planning to collect fines, be sure to check with local and state law before assessing fines for violations that do not involve property damage. Here's a link to HUD's website for more materials to help you implement smoke-free housing. Thank you for your time today, and be sure to reach out if you have more questions to smokefreepublichousing@hud.gov.
Good day. My name is Leroy Ferguson, and I'm a housing program specialist within the Office of Public Housing, Management and Occupancy Division. Today I would like to talk to you about one of the webinars we developed in support of HUD's Public Housing Smoke-Free Rule. Topic of the discussion for today is community engagement. Community engagement is a key element in a successful transition to smoke-free housing. Your residents and staff need to be part of the decision-making process in establishing the new policy. Listening to the input shows residents their opinions matter. Getting residents engaged early is important to adoption, implementation, and compliance with smoke-free public housing policies. This webinar will show steps and practices PHAs can use to engage the PHA community. The series of webinars will help you familiarize yourself with the aspects of the rule. However, it is important to note that webinars are not a substitute for reading and understanding regulatory guidance and the smoke-free rule. PHAs must implement the smoke-free policies no later than July 30th, 2018. PHAs that have already implemented smoke-free policies may choose to implement earlier. PHAs that implement a smoke-free policy during the voluntary stage must ensure their policies are consistent with the final rule. What is a PHA community? HUD staff, PHA staff, housing residents, and the local community at large. HUD anticipates that PHAs will continue to build on their established community relationships. What is community engagement? Community engagement is a process of bringing a group of people together around an issue. In this case, smoke-free public housing. Why is community engagement needed? Community buy-in is critical to successful implementation of any policy. Residents will buy into policies if they are part of the decision-making process. Engage your community around a few key issues, such as what is included in the smoke-free policy and how it will be enforced. By collecting your community's feedback, you'll be able to tailor your policy to their needs. Community engagement will result in better acceptance and compliance of the smoke-free policy. When should a PHA engage the community? You should engage your community early and often about the policy. As a quote from John Kane of the Boston Housing Authority indicates, community engagement is a long process that includes both residents and the staff in the policy process. The Boston Housing Authority commented that during the smoke-free policy process, community engagement of residents and staff was critical. He stated, there was an aspect of resistance not only from residents, but from the staff who are now responsible for enforcing this policy. Some of the staff smoked and some residents. Some staff thought the policy was overreaching and intrusive. These attitudes are difficult, but still must give respect to those people voicing their opinions. The best way we could deal with those attitudes was through resident engagement and staff training. You will need to reach out, consult with, and engage your residents throughout the process. Explaining the HUD rule and how it would affect tenants' lives will be essential to the policy's success. Meeting with tenants to discuss the smoke-free policy is an ongoing, essential part of the implementation process. There are many topics to discuss, including the benefits of the smoke-free policy, the smoke-free rule, your PHA policy, and implementation guidelines, and resources to help your tenants comply with the new policy. Meeting with residents a few times during the 18 months of implementation is recommended. The Resident Advisory Board can provide insights and how the community perceives the opportunities as well. Who should reach out to the PHA community? HUD staff, residents, resident advisory boards, and local communities such as social services, the health department, faith-based organizations, nonprofits, resident guests, and people who use services provided on the PHA property, such as child care centers. PHAs are often already working with these outside entities. Providing these groups with information about the smoke-free policy can be included in your regular communications with them. Who can engage the community? Again, your PHA community at large, HUD staff, PHA staff, residents, local and state governments, and the public can assist in engaging the community. Providing these groups with information about the smoke-free policy can be included in your regular communications with them. Older adults who can help sway the opinions of the public. Parents have a vested interest as well with the successful implementation of the rule, as it can improve the health of their public housing children. How can PHAs engage the community? Meetings, meetings, and meetings. Although it's not prescriptive to have more than one meeting, public meetings, one-on-one meetings, kickoff meetings, and resident council meetings, town hall meetings, and industry meetings are important to get the smoke-free word out. As you start the policy development process, provide residents with as much information as possible. Post flyers, writing letters, and providing information on your website and social media about the HUD's rule. Include steps to your PHA to take to formalize your policy and how residents can get involved. If you need support in developing a timeline of activities, check out the guidebook and the fact sheet, recommended 18 months timeline, which was posted on the HUD website. Focus on the message. Always focus on the benefits of the smoke-free rule. Some benefits may include less resident complaints about secondhand smoke, reduction in maintenance costs, less risk of deadly fires, and the opportunity to use housing as a platform to improve the quality of life for public housing residents, especially the elderly and children. Your PHA's central message should be clear and consistent about the benefits of going smoke-free. Smoke-free policies are good for residents, staff, and guests. The national market and the general cultural norms about smoking are aligning in the United States to keep people safe from secondhand smoke where they live, learn, work, and play. HUD's rule and your policy will align with this national trend. Community champions. Your community champions are your spokesmen and spokeswomen for the policy. Provide them with as much information about the policy as possible. Create opportunities for them to present at meetings. You'll want to make posters featuring community champions with a quote of how they plan to comply with the policy and their expected benefits. Identifying and celebrating your community champions is one way to show your residents that you appreciate them and the effort they will put into marketing the policy as a success. Optional would be conducting resident surveys. Surveys are a great way to give all tenants an opportunity to provide comments on the smoke-free policy before it's implemented. Surveys can help you and your staff better understand how many residents already have smoke-free homes and how many are looking forward to the new policy. Surveys also help you identify areas where you may want to add extra signage about the policy. Another optional task is coordinate and track efforts. Track the number of residents who are engaging with the policy and the type of feedback you are receiving and how you are incorporating that feedback in the essential aspects of the rule. Tracking this information will allow you to better understand the ways that your policy and enforcement are evolving because of the community engagement. It is important to communicate to your residents and your board how you are taking into consideration the wants and needs and hopes of your community. Show appreciation and support and compliance even after implementation. Continue to stress the importance and benefits of smoke-free housing. Next steps. PHAs will be required to adopt and implement smoke-free policies by 30 July 2018. That will include updating the PHA plan, leases, ACOPs, and all leases and lease amendments must be in place by 30 July 2018. HUD believes that reasonable accommodations are considered on a case-by-case basis. However, allowing a resident to smoke is not a reasonable accommodation request that will be granted. And another critical aspect is early buy-in. Early buy-in is critical. So HUD has begun to field questions related to the smoke-free rule. And one of those questions, how long should a PHA request for comments on the smoke-free policy need to be open for residents to comment? And the answer, the rule has no specific number of days a PHA comment period is open. However, the time frame for comment period must follow HUD regulatory guidance for residents' input into update of the revision and amendments to the PHA plan. Questions regarding the smoke-free policy can be addressed to smokefreepublichousing@hud.gov. Additional information and resources available such as webinars, sample presentations, fact sheets, and a guidebook available at the following website. We thank you for your participation and we look forward to your support and implementation of HUD's smoke-free public housing rule. Thank you.